Which driver has fared best in the races? Hello, my name is Alex Does F1 Stuff and welcome to part number 2 or episode number 2 of determining who is the best driver of 2020 overall, and today we are looking at race performance. If you have not seen the first video of this small tiny little series at the end of the season, it was based on the qualifying performances. I'll pop a little card in the corner to that video. But today we are looking at race performances, so without further ado we will jump straight on in to who's fared best in the races this season. And we begin of course with the champions Mercedes. So the graph format is going to look a little bit like this. We have their overall race gaps. Lewis Hamilton in the black bars and Valtteri Bottas on the left in the turquoise bars. So this graph is fairly straightforward. It just denotes the gap advantage each driver had to their teammate. So as I've highlighted just underneath the graph title as well, DNFs on Lewis Hamilton's side is a DNF for Bottas, as it actually benefited Hamilton and he therefore finished ahead of Bottas because of a DNF, if that makes sense. So you can simply count up the black bars and that's how many times Lewis Hamilton outperformed him, either by a gap or because of a DNF, or they finished on different laps. And then just to note as well, that plus 1 lap doesn't necessarily denote them being lapped by the teammate, it just means they finished on different racing laps. So I couldn't actually get a specific gap, but they both finished the race, so I couldn't say it was a DNF. They just finished on different racing laps. They weren't 100% all of the times lapped by their teammate. And then from this graph, I can work out an average gap ahead for each driver. So Lewis Hamilton on average when he was ahead of Bottas was 18.2 seconds clear and Bottas was just 10.1 seconds clear. And then also I can fill in their DNFs and times they finished 1 lap ahead of the teammate. So it was 1 DNF for Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton finished on different racing laps on 1 occasion to Valtteri Bottas. And then of course I can just quickly fill in their head-to-head battles as well, 12-4 in favour of Lewis Hamilton, and then like we did similarly in the qualifying graphs, I can map on their racing positions. Lewis Hamilton in the black line with the turquoise dots and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise line with the black dots. And you can see clearly where Valtteri Bottas' season sort of unravelled. Round number 4, the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, where his tyre failed and he finished outside of the points. Lewis Hamilton was very lucky to come away with a victory there. And then also from rounds 14 pretty much to the end of the season, it was a bit of a bad end, unfortunately, for Valtteri Bottas, but that's the way. That is motor racing. You can't always have it. But I mean, he's never really had it in the first place, but no one can always get it, if that makes any sense. And then from this, I can pull up their average positions as well. So Lewis Hamilton had an average finishing position of P2 compared to P4 for Valtteri Bottas. And then finally, a small addition to this panel over the qualifying panel is the points of each driver. Once again, Lewis Hamilton the black line with the turquoise dots and Valtteri Bottas the turquoise with the black dots. It started well for Valtteri. The season starts well, much like 2019. It started well and then didn't. It's just, if the championship was 3 rounds long, boom, he's done it. He'll be a 2-time world champion. But the seasons aren't 3 races long, they're more like 20. And it's unfortunate that he's not been able to continue that form from races 1 to races 3 throughout the whole of the season. And so with the pro forma of all of these graph panels done and dusted, we will come back and collate all of this data at the very end. We will move on into team number 2, and that is Red Bull. And you can see that the only time that Alex Albon managed to outperform Max Verstappen was when Max Verstappen failed to finish. That is absolutely ridiculous. In the head-to-heads in the bottom right, it is 12-4. Max Verstappen had 5 DNFs throughout this year, 2 for Alex Albon, and on 2 occasions, Max Verstappen finished on a different racing lap to Alex Albon with an average gap ahead of 32.5 seconds. That is crazy. And then you can see the massive inconsistencies in Alex Albon's race performance looking at the Red Bull positions graph. And if you remember, and if you have seen the qualifying positions, it's very, very similar. Albon is just incredibly inconsistent compared to the consistency of Max Verstappen. And then leaving Red Bull, we head to team number 3, McLaren, and once again, they are extremely similar. Carlos Sainz in the blue, Lando Norris in the orange. Now, they're not as similar as they were in qualifying. There's a small amount of differences this time round, but they are still very, very, very bloody even. So the average gap ahead actually lies towards Carlos Sainz by around 6 seconds. But in terms of DNFs, Carlos Sainz ends up having more, including a one did not start as well, but on one occasion Lando Norris managed to finish on a different racing lap to Carlos Sainz. In the head-to-head it is 9-8 to Lando Norris, and you can see looking at their points graph, Norris had a much better 2/3 of the season, but it wasn't until the last third of the race, the last couple of rounds, that Carlos Sainz kicked into gear and managed to get past. Average position of P8 for Norris and P7 for Carlos. And then leaving team number 3 and heading to the Pink Panthers. Now they're a bit more consistent in the races than they were in qualifying. Qualifying, God knows what was going on with Racing Point. They were all over the place. But racing, they were much, much more consistent, and the advantage 100% lies with Sergio Perez. 15 seconds ahead compared to Stroll's 7.7, 5 DNFs for Lance Stroll, and on one occasion Lance Stroll actually finished on a different racing lap, the lap ahead of Sergio Perez, and the points, they sort of jostled, and you can see that for the first half of the season, Lance Stroll was actually ahead of Sergio Perez, who had a stellar end to the season, and you can see that just huge flat line of performance from Lance Stroll after his sort of COVID incident in the Eiffel Grand Prix. It went downhill from there. In terms of average positions, they were fairly similar, P6 for Sergio Perez and P7 for Lance Stroll. And then leaving Racing Point and heading to Renault, and this one is pretty much all Daniel Ricciardo. Once again, 17 seconds ahead and 1.7 seconds ahead for Esteban Ocon, 4 DNFs for Ocon, 1 for Ricciardo, and they each finished a lap ahead of each other on one occasion, 13-4 in the head-to-head, and the points is just absolutely ridiculous. Daniel Ricciardo walking away with that as well. An average position of P7 for Ricciardo and P8 for Ocon. Now this one is extremely similar to their qualifying one. It definitely lies towards Daniel Ricciardo, but their actual average qualifying performance and average race performance, they're very similar drivers. It's just Daniel Ricciardo has a slight edge all the time over Esteban Ocon, but they're still very, very even. It's just Daniel gets that small advantage every single time. And then leaving Renault, we head to Ferrari, and Ferrari, I would say, is actually relatively even, to be honest. It is 15.4 seconds ahead for Charles Leclerc to 12.9 for Sebastian Vettel, which is very, very even. DNFs, it is 4 for Leclerc, 2 for Vettel, but on 2 occasions throughout this season, Leclerc finished on the lead lap and Sebastian Vettel did not. The head-to-head was 10-5 towards Leclerc, and the points is one of the biggest gaps between teammates ever. They were a little bit inconsistent throughout the season, Ferrari, and an average position of P7 for Leclerc and P10 for Sebastian. So not too bad from the Scuderia, but definitely, it could be better. It could be better, but that's definitely down to Sebastian Vettel's very, very poor season. But more on that in another episode, probably. And then leaving Ferrari, we head on into AlphaTauri. Now, AlphaTauri were actually a little bit even in qualifying, but races, I'm not 100% sure how to call this one. So, average gap ahead, 21.3 seconds for Gasly, 11.5 for Kvyat. DNFs, it is more weighted towards Gasly, but times on different laps, times finishing on different laps. Gasly, on 3 occasions, finished on the lead lap compared to Daniel Kvyat, which is a lot. That's a lot of times. You're in the same car. I know in the races lots of things can happen during that, and that could contribute to it, but have it happen 3 times, that's a lot. There is a big disparity in the points that especially comes courtesy of the victory in Italy. The head-to-head actually is very, very even, 9-8, but their average positions, you can see Kvyat had a bit of a turbulent end to the season. He was very consistent at the beginning, and then at the end, it just sort of got away from him. It was massively different to his qualifying. So in his qualifying, it was a very turbulent start to the season, but at the end, he was actually very, very solid, and getting to the point where he was outperforming Gasly, but that's not happened this time round. And that shows average position of P8 for Gasly and P11 for Danny. And then leaving AlphaTauri, we head on into Alfa Romeo, and once again, just like qualifying, these teammates are exceptionally, exceptionally close. Apart from in their average gap ahead though, 15 seconds for Raikkonen and 2.4 for Giovinazzi. Giovinazzi has had more DNFs, 3-1, and actually Giovinazzi has finished on the lead lap over Kimi Raikkonen on just one occasion. They both ended the season on 4 points, a head-to-head of 12-5 in favour of Raikkonen, but their finishing positions were very similar, P13 for Raikkonen and P14 for Giovinazzi, and they were both extremely consistent, and you can see they both follow very similar trends. So when the car was doing well, they both did well, and when the car was struggling, they both struggled. Which is something that if you go back to the Ferrari one, there's a big disparity between the two drivers, and you can't really see where the car was struggling, because both drivers had such a chasm between the two. But when they're nice, close, like Alfa Romeo here, you can really see where the car struggled and where the car performed. And then heading into the penultimate team of today's episode, and that is Haas. And once again, it is fairly even between the Haas boys. 19 seconds ahead for Kevin Magnussen and 9.6 for Romain Grosjean. But Magnussen has had 6 DNFs compared to 3 for Grosjean, and neither driver has actually finished on different laps than the other. Points, it's 2-1 in terms of that battle. Finishing positions, P15 for Grosjean and also P15 for Magnussen, and 7 all in the head-to-head. So 100% probably the most even team on this field. Maybe McLaren were up there as well in terms of average position and points, etc. But definitely Haas are a contender for equal teammates. And then finally we head on in to Williams, a team that had a ridiculously dominated qualifying battle in favour of George Russell, but actually in the races it is much more even. So in the average gap ahead, it is actually Nicholas Latifi who has the advantage, 16.0 seconds ahead of Russell, and then Russell was just 14 seconds ahead on average over Latifi. Russell had 4 DNFs to Latifi's 2, and on one occasion Russell finished on the different lap to Latifi, 10-6 in the head-to-head, and the points, I wasn't 100% sure what to do with the points, as Russell scored them in the Mercedes and not in the Williams, but I've still kept them in this graph, but definitely in the later ones in the categories that we'll get on into a moment, I have removed those points. But very similarly to the Alfa Romeo team, they are exceptionally close in the races, and you can see where the car was struggling and where the car was performing, and both drivers had an average finishing position of P15. And now with all of the panels all done and dusted, we can get on into ranking each driver on 8 different categories. 8 different categories. Qualifying it was 7, races it is 8. So each driver has received a rank depending on how well they've performed in each category, and also there are now joint ranks. I've added that in, as before, regardless of what their value was, whether it was the same as someone else or not, they received a descending rank from 1 through to 20, ascending rank from 1 through to 20, whereas now there are joint ranks for people that have matching scores. So moving on into those categories, we start with number 1, and that is the average gap to your teammate. Now, the data value associated to each bar is irrelevant, it is the order from left to right, which is. And interestingly to note here, Alex Albon failed to actually register a time against Verstappen. He only outperformed Max when Max failed to finish the race, so there was no average gap to take throughout the season. Whether you take that as a testament to Max's performance or Albon's underperformance, that is up to you to interpret. Then category number 2 is the head-to-head difference to your teammate. Ricciardo leads this one, being 9 ahead of Ocon, and Ocon was therefore 9 behind Ricciardo. Then it is Hamilton, Verstappen, Raikkonen, Leclerc, Russell, Perez, Norris and Gasly, and then we've got the 2 Haas cars who were equal on 7 apiece. Now we move on into some consistency graphs now. We start with the standard deviation of your positions. Who was the most consistent throughout this season? And it is actually Max Verstappen who beats out Lewis Hamilton, then Kimi Raikkonen, George Russell, Magnussen, Perez, Grosjean, Giovinazzi, all the way down to Bottas, Leclerc and Albon. They had the least consistent season in terms of their standard deviation of their positions. And then similarly to the standard deviation, we have the range of positions. Your worst race finishing position minus your best race finishing position. And once again, we have Verstappen and Hamilton leading this one, but Russell is now P3 from Raikkonen and Giovinazzi, the 2 Alfa Romeos doing very well, then Magnussen, Latifi, all the way down to Bottas, once again in the bottom 3, followed by the 2 Alfa Tauris at the very back. which that one sort of surprised me. I didn't really think that AlphaTauri had that much of an inconsistent season, but to have 14 positions between your worst position and your best position, that's a lot. That is a lot of positions. I suppose that counts for Gasly having that P1 finish in Italy and then having a slightly worse off performance, and then perhaps Kvyat as well having a very strong performance in Imola P4, almost on the podium, and then having a not so good race, but that's what the consistency one's for. And then just to save a little bit of time, I've not animated the next four, but here they are. Top left, we have the difference in average position to your teammate. So Max Verstappen's average finishing position was P3 or P2 or something like that, and then Albon was 5 positions behind that. So Verstappen was 5 ahead, and Albon was therefore 5 behind. In the top right, we have their average position subtracted from their best position. So how far ahead was your best position to your average? Then the bottom left is just the inverse of that. Your worst position, subtract your average. How far behind was your worst to your average? And then in the bottom right, we have a new category, the percentage of points scored for your team. How even were you throughout, or how dominant were you in your team? The more dominant you are, the better you performed, the higher your rank. The more even you were, the lower your rank. And so I have collated all of these 8 ranks, given each driver one of them, and then averaged them out, and we end up with a table that looks something like this. We have the best racers of 2020. Max Verstappen leads, from Lewis Hamilton, from Sergio Perez, joint over the 8 ranks. Then Kimi Raikkonen is up there, as are the 2 Haas cars. Then it's Ricciardo, Gasly, Russell, Leclerc, Sainz, Giovinazzi, Latifi, Vettel, Norris, Stroll, Ocon, Kvyat, Bottas, and Albon had the worst race performances of 2020. Now, don't take this list too seriously, as I can change the way I rank the drivers, I can add categories, I can remove categories, and these results will change. But I feel that my 8 categories and the way that they are ranked cover pretty much all bases towards consistency, how you performed against your teammate, and everything else along those lines. So I feel they cover most of the bases in the races, but if you have any ideas of improvements for this categories and for these rankings, then please let me know down in the comments below. If you've disagreed or agreed, also let me know. And as well, if you've got any ideas of your own statistical videos, I've got an email down in the description as well, which you can pop me a line if you don't want to pop a public comment in the section. As always, my Twitter DMs are also open to people to message me. Now, hopefully the driver progression video number 3 in this small little series will be out soon. I've almost finished that one, and then I need to start work on video number 4, and then I can collate all of those informations from the 4 videos to make a 5th overall. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys there.